Hello, today's podcast will be about the second industrial revolution. Today, my two partners will be Dev and Max. All three of us will discuss some factors, effects, and causes of the industrial revolution. So now let's talk about the advancements in new industries, specifically steel, chemicals, and electricity, and how they led to new possibilities in production. First, iron and steel. The development of new techniques for working with iron and steel was one of the outstanding British achievements of the Industrial Revolution. Basically, the achievement was changing the fuel of the iron and the steel industry. This change was from charcoal to coal and enormously increased the production of these metals. Abundant cheap iron thus became an outstanding feature of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Uses for cast iron include bridge construction, framework of fireproof factories, and more. Next, let's talk about electricity. Pioneers for electricity and its uses were a collection of scientists, including Franklin from Pennsylvania, Alessandro Volta from Italy, and Michael Faraday of Britain. In the U.S., Edison applied his genius to finding uses for electricity and developed the carbon filament lamp, showed how this could rival gas, a natural resource. The great innovations in communication, however, derived also from electricity. The first was the electric telegraph created by two British inventors, Sir William Cooke and Sir Charles Wheatstone. The American inventor Samuel F.B. Morse devised a signaling code that was subsequently adopted all over the world, also known as Morse code. The telegraph system also played an important part in opening up the American West by providing rapid aid in the maintenance of law and order. Last, let's talk about chemicals. In short, this created more rapid bleaching techniques in the textile industry, a shift to organic chemistry as a whole, including artificial dye and fibers, and medicinal and pharmaceutical materials as medical knowledge increased and drugs began to play a constructive part in therapy. Next, Max will tell you about how some of these innovations affected trade, migrations, and global interactions.
The Second Industrial Revolution changed the way that humans interacted, moved, and communicated with others. Essentially, it made everyone's life faster. As my man Tyler just said, during the late 19th and early 20th century, there were many advancements in new industries. These advancements, mainly in steel and electricity, led to new, innovative ways of a product being produced. As a matter of fact, without the new inventions in communication that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, you probably wouldn't be able to enjoy this wonderful podcast that you're listening to right now. Now, let's take a deeper look into some of the different advancements in communication that were happening. In 1837, in London, England, Sir William Fothergill Cooke and Charles Wheatstone got the ball rolling for the greater inventions later in the decade. They invented the first commercial telegraph system. Throughout the century, telegraph networks rapidly grew. By 1856, the Atlantic Telegraph Company was founded. This led to a commercial telegraph being sent across the Atlantic Ocean. We now have communications and easier telegraphs being sent across the ocean for the first time ever. However, this would all be trumped in 1876 when a man by the name of Alexander Graham Bell, perhaps you've heard of him, patented the telephone. This massive growth in communication had major effects on trade and global interactions. For the first time in history, people that were separated by an ocean could easily communicate. They could discuss business. They could negotiate trade. These global interactions led to an increase in trade, because instead of taking 2 weeks, it took 2 minutes to reach out and negotiate with people hundreds or thousands of miles away. Couple this with the invention of the commercial radio by Guglielmo Marconi in 1895, and one could tell that the spreading of news, negotiations, and communications had never been easier. However, achievements in communication were not the only achievements of this time. Speed of transportation had increased like never seen before. Horses were being replaced by oil or electric-powered vehicles. Infrastructure was transported throughout the industrialized world on thousands of miles of railroad tracks. Hell, 2 brothers in North Carolina invented flight in 1903. It was a time of great advancements in transportation, and none may be as important as Ford and his assembly line, which began to mass-produce cars in 1913. This led to migrations towards cities because that is where the jobs were, and people now had the necessary transportation to move. This, paired with the thousands of miles of tracks that were put down during this time, led to an increase in trade globally and nationally. The resources found in the heartland of the U.S. could quickly make its way to any large coastal city. During the Second Industrial Revolution, trade, global interactions, and migrations were made way easier. However, there were indirect effects as well. My buddy Dev is going to tell us more about that.
Industrial workers created labor unions to defend their interests in negotiations. The other purpose of labor unions was to assist industrial workers during illness, accidents, and old age. During the 19th century, British labor unions accounted to approximately 2 million people, while the German and American unions accounted to 1 million each. They often held movements advocating for improved wages and working conditions. Women were subjected to low wages and other forms of injustice. They demanded the right to vote, better wages, and overall economic and political equality. In 1869, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton created the National Women's Suffrage Association. Many such associations, which were created by and led by women, advocated for women's rights. Before industrialization, education in Europe was in the hands of church. Philosophers like Adam Smith concluded that a well-instructed worker is more productive and less liable. This became the basis for the public school system. Now, Tyler will explain and compare capitalism and socialism.
Socialism and capitalism. What do they mean? Socialism is an economic and political system in which the government controls all means of production, while capitalism is an economic and political system in which property, business, and industry are owned by private individuals and not by the state. The goals for each differ. In socialism, the goal is economic and social equality through redistribution of wealth, while for capitalism, the goal is to create wealth through private ownership of property and business. Some terms associated with socialism include centralized government planning, command economy, planned economy, wealth distribution, and more, while some terms associated with capitalism include free market, free enterprise, supply and demand, laissez-faire, and more. Some countries who embrace the socialism system include Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam, while capitalism include United States, Hong Kong, Germany, Japan, Singapore, and more of the advanced countries. Some people associated with each system include Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and John Maynard Keynes for socialism, while for capitalism, Adam Smith, Frederick Hayek, and Milton Friedman. Now, Dev will discuss the hazards of industrial life, including pollution, overcrowding, poor working conditions, and child labor, and how it impacted life at this time in the industrial world.
Industrial life had many hazards. The newly established factories and steel mills bleached the sky with smoke and other pollutants. The primary drivers of industrialization, steam engines and railroads, contributed to this air pollution. Industrialized areas were unable to keep pace with the growing urban population, which resulted in overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions. Industrial wastes were dumped into rivers, causing the spread of many diseases. The tightly packed urban population facilitated the spread of disease. In London, the big stink was caused by the industrial waste dumped into River Thames. Even though factory workers earned higher wages compared to some agricultural workers, but this came as a result of higher working hours and poor working conditions. Prioritizing profits, factory owners often hired children and women who got paid less. Now Max will discuss how industrialization impacted imperialism in the 19th century.
During the 19th century, many countries were taken over by imperialism. The taking over of imperialism during this time period could definitely be attributed with industrialization. This is because in order for industrialization to be successful, you had to have access to resources, and countries soon found out that the resources would be cheaper if it came from one of their own colonies as opposed to negotiating trade with a country. This is captured perfectly in the primary source, The Economic Basis of Imperialism, by John Hobson in 1902. Hobson writes, Imperialists argue thus: we must have markets for our growing manufactures, we must have new outlets for the investment of our surplus capital. Such expansion is a necessity of life to a nation with our great and growing powers of production. As shown here, the argument for imperialism is that it is needed if the country wishes to succeed. More markets must be made available. More resources must be accessible. More places for capital to be invested. Establishing colonies and growth of industry went hand in hand. Not only this, but having colonies allowed a country to protect its world trade. The colonies they had as a result of their imperialistic style provided these industrializing nations with bases around the world where they could restock and refuel their ships, both military and commercial. The growth of industry heightened the need for countries to be imperialistic. For example, we can take a look at Germany, but I'm going to let my guy Dev dive deeper into that.
After the Second Industrial Revolution, Germany became an industrial power and a rival of the Great Britain. Firstly, they eliminated the trade barriers that existed prior to the unification, which made Germany an attractive market for the investors. Germany developed an extensive railroad system that would both promote and assist with industrialization. Germany used its rich iron and coal resources to develop industries within the country. The development of the new steel industries was another attempt by Germany to industrialize. Germany additionally expanded its banking and capital markets to attract investors and producers. They were also able to learn the pros and cons of the British industrialization to avoid making the same mistakes.